Taxi drivers, what's the deepest secret you've overheard in your cab? I don't drive anymore, but I used to drive in Memphis. I would sit at the Peabody on Friday and Saturday evenings, usually with the elite but not so above taking a cab kind of folks. One evening, the parking lot was packed. The valets were so far behind I could barely get my cab past the other cars to get in. So I'm keeping an eye on the concierge at the door so I can see when he waves me over. I'm looking, and who comes out the door but Steven Seagal? The concierge waves a town car down to the door, Seagal gets in, and it takes off. And I'm kind of in awe because that's the second closest I've been to a celebrity type so far. 5 minutes later, I'm contemplating leaving when the concierge whistles and waves me down. I pull up to the curb, the concierge opens the back door, and this older-looking gentleman gets in, maybe in his 50s, wearing a duster-length wool coat, holding a handkerchief over his mouth and nose and a Kangol hat. I figure he's got a cold, no big deal. I ask where he wants to go. He gives me an address in a nice residential area on the other side of the city. I pull out of the parking lot, start the meter, and ask the guy how he wants to get there. He asks which way is better. I tell him going through town is cheaper, but taking the loop is faster. He tells me to use my best judgment, so I start going through town. About a third of the way there, he asks if I saw Steven Seagal earlier. I told him I had, and I wished I could have taken him. He lowers his handkerchief, and it's Steven frickin' Seagal. Turns out he had sent a double in the town car. We talked a little about this and that, and when I dropped him off, he handed me $100 and told me to keep the change. Wait, what? So Steven Seagal was that desperate for privacy that he sent a decoy? I guess even if you're a B or C celebrity, it makes sense. Smart enough move. And I'm starting to think he's actually more interesting than his movies. Story 2. I was a dispatcher at a local cab company for a few years. We'd been picking up a young woman and ferrying her from her house to her boyfriend's for a few months. Eventually, she stopped calling. In a town with call cabs, we always kind of take that as a sign of a breakup and gossip about it over the radios and in the office. Then, a couple months later, the news hit that her boyfriend had attempted to terminate her. She survived and was rescued, but only just. The picture painted of this man was a weird one. He traveled alone a lot in Israel and Russia, immersed himself in martial arts and weapons training, and had an incredibly shallow effect. I believe they had just broken up and she started seeing someone else and he hunted her down. We always worried about regulars after that, sometimes calling the ones who dropped off the radar. The darkly poetic element to all of this was his last name, Jaeger, which means hunter in German. Story 3. NYC taxi driver told me his deep, dark secret one night. He picked me up after I'd finished working a long bar shift and had enjoyed an even longer after-party. I don't know if my level of intoxicatedness made me come across as trustingly friendly or blackout forgetful, but it was a long drive to where I lived in Harlem, so we started telling stories. He looked like a caricature of a Mexican guy, stocky, tan, mustached, etc. We even spoke a bit in Spanish, but his accent was very unique. This was due to the fact that he'd moved to Mexico from Pakistan, his native country, and had posed as a Mexican to sneak into America via the usual over-the-border routes. He'd done this fearing America would the hell out of his homeland in their search for He had to disguise his true origins to make himself a more acceptable illegal alien, and the plan worked perfectly. His wife and daughter followed soon after. The taxi job he'd worked so hard to excel at was now supporting the family and paying his daughter's way through college. Unfortunately, once he'd gone to America, his old job required too many credentials to allow him to remain laying low in his new life. Back home, he'd been a biochemist. Story 4. Actual cab driver, posting from my cab on a slow night at that. About a year and a half ago, I was driving some folks from the college town where I worked to a much larger city about 40 minutes away. Surprisingly large fare. Anyway, over the course of the trip, it became clear that they had come into town to deal substance at the club I picked them up at. Part of their conversation was in Spanish, so I'm not super confident, but I think they sold about half a kilo that night. They paid me from a huge roll of mostly large bills. The leader of the group was also clearly as hell and started to get really freaked out and insisted that I pull off the expressway to get some soda. I had an unopened Monster Energy in the cab and I handed it over. Ended up making almost 100% on the tip. One of the very best runs I've ever done. Story 5. I've driven cabs in Australia, on and off, for about 2 years. I think the worst story/confession I got was from a dude who rushedly booked my cab to travel from one end of the Gold Coast, the city I live and work in, to the other. He told me he was in such a hurry because his girlfriend had just run him and told him she had been mistreated. She went to a party without him because they had been fighting. During the course of the ride, he told me that he had been thinking of dumping her, but that with this, he didn't know what to do. Dropped him off at her place and he was pretty messed up. Pretty bad situation to be in for both of them. Hope they managed to sort everything out. Well, at least he got a good price for his therapy session, and I hope he tipped well. Story 6. That the guy got his buddy pregnant and that he couldn't sleep from seeing the kid's heartbeat the day before. We were on a midnight cookout run. It's a fast food chain, the Soma of VA and NC. Also, that a guy's life was exactly like Nick Cage's in Leaving Las Vegas, confessed that his Filipino wife left him and took the kids years earlier, and he was basically drinking himself. I've learned the best is to just sit back and take it all in. Story 7. Short stint driving cab in Boston area. 2 very attractive passengers come in. I assume they are a couple, even though the man is clearly far older than the woman, talking loudly about getting away from Boston and going to Paris. I try to strike up some conversation and ask them how long they are going for, and they say they are moving there the next day. Turns out the dude was married, like to another woman. His wife was out for the night, and he was just packing up some stuff and moving without telling her, or his 3 kids, until he was there. Asked me if I could give them a ride to the airport in the morning, and then I'd have to meet them around the block. I said no, I got no tip. Story 8. Drove a cab for a while on the weekends while in college. I dated this girl for about a month when she confessed she had a boyfriend in Germany. She told me all about him and that he was going to move in with her. Stopped seeing her. A few months later, I picked up an intoxicated couple at a bar, and they're all over each other. The guy is German. We drop off the girl, then he has me take him home. He starts telling me how he had just moved here to be with his girlfriend, but she's out of town for the weekend. He says American girls are easy because they're into guys with accents, and he cheats on his obvious girlfriend all the time. Yep, it was the guy. I said nothing as I dropped him at Carrie's place. Always wonder what happened to them. Story 9. I picked up an older gentleman from a local discreet all-male hotel. He was articulate, sweet, funny, and also a male. He was on his way to see his mother at the nursing home. He told me his mother does not know what he does and thinks he is just a teacher. He wants to quit working in the hotel, but he can't afford to keep his house and pay for his mother's care on teaching wages. He was very forthcoming with all of this and became a regular client. He tipped very well also. Story 10. Was in a cab in NYC with a Nigerian driver, and a fire engine with sirens screaming came up behind us. This guy decided he had to get out of the way by driving faster than the fire engine. He was yelling at cars to move, weaving in and out of traffic, cutting in the oncoming lane, etc., just going. I finally told him, you could just pull over. This seemed like a totally new idea to him. He pulled over and the fire engine whizzed past. I'm guessing he's never seen a fire engine before, or maybe he thought it was a personal challenge or something. Story 11. I ordered a cab one night after I missed the bus home. After telling the driver where to go, he got a call. He apologized and closed the plexiglass window to take it privately. I guess the ceiling on it was off or something like that because I had heard him very clearly say that he'd pick up his kilo in 20 minutes. He then opened the window, apologized again, and asked me if I had seen the recent football game. At least he was a nice guy. Just to clarify, this is Southern Florida. Odds are it was substance. Again, he was a pretty nice dude. I even slid him an extra 10 because he found a shortcut that shaved 15 minutes off of the trip. Story 12. This is only semi-relevant, but I picked up a guy once who started talking about a night he recently had out of town and met some hot bartender or something. It was a very awkward conversation because it seemed like there was a lot of weird pauses whenever I would reply, and a lot of his responses to what I said didn't quite make sense. After a solid 15 minutes of this, I realized he was talking to a friend via a Bluetooth headset. I've never felt so dumb. Story 13. My grandfather drove a taxi for a little while in the 1950s, important to the story. So he does an overnight shift and picks up a woman with a guy my grandfather thought was her husband and drives them to her house. The next morning, Sunday, he picks up the same woman at her house with a different guy. They were on their way to church. He got a good tip on that one. Story 14. I can't believe this is a question on Reddit, and I actually have a good answer. John Corbet's crappy vanity project band was in town, and I picked up the 4 of them up and brought them to the bars. All of them were talking about how they were itching for some college town girls, especially John. Corbet has been dating Bo Derek since 2002, poor thing. Also, I saw his set the next day, and they should spend less time getting wasted and cheating on their women and more time practicing how to play and sing. Story 15. A few months ago, I was called to pick up a 20-something man at the local prison. He had been pulled over for DUI and had cooperated with the police during the sobriety tests. Unfortunately, he had failed pretty much all of them. When the police asked that he take a test, he flat out refused. This did not sit particularly well with the police, and he was arrested, taken to jail, and had his driver's license suspended. The police needed me to take him home, which was 3 towns away. During the 35-mile trip, he made some phone calls, which I got to listen in on. To Grandma, without a license, he could no longer afford to keep his apartment and so would be moving back in with her. To Mom, the lucrative government job offer that he just received had a valid driver's license required clause. To his friend, the only reason that he'd cooperated with the police at the start was so that they wouldn't search his currently impounded car and find all of the substance. Also got to hear several times that the sobriety tests weren't fair because the line they'd ask him to walk was on a slight hill. Also, it was cold and he was shivering, which naturally affected his balance. He figured that a lawyer could get him his license back. I wished him good luck. The "your case doesn't stand a snowball's chance" part was left unsaid. He did not leave a tip. Story 16. Not much of a secret, but I think this is the most appropriate thread for this story. My dad picked up some sketchy-looking guy who was mumbling to himself for the whole ride and took him to his destination. A couple of days later, my dad gets a call from the police saying that the guy he picked up terminated someone the night that my dad picked him up. He then had to testify against him in court as a witness. I don't know the outcome of the case, though. Story 17. My best friend had a pretty rough relationship with a guy who got her pregnant and forced her to get a termination. He was verbally cruel and always told her very nasty things, then played the "I love you" card to get her to forgive him. He was on the phone with her one time when we were in a cab with another friend and us being intoxicated. My friend and I just started reaming her out, telling her the guy's trash, doesn't deserve to be with him, is mentally sick, etc. And the cab driver, with this big, crappy, eating smile on his face, started joining in, telling my friend to tell the guy to screw off and to give him the phone so he could put him in his place, saying that he'd get his cousins to wreck his crap if he tries to do anything to hurt her. She ended up just hanging up and bursting into tears, and when we were at our destination, the cab driver spent 10 or so minutes speaking to her to make her to stop crying. We tipped him very well. Story 18. Actual cabbie in a college town. Closest I have is when I picked up a bunch of guys from the ugliest frat in town. They were all talking about how one of them was the man for his intimate exploits that night. I like money, so I played into it. As the story progresses, I come to find out he's being praised for some girl that passed out at the party. I dropped them, collected the fair and generous tip. Then I told the guy flat out that he is a criminal and that I hope he ends up in prison with a ruined life. They went from intoxicated laughter and high five straight to slack-jawed shock. I drove away with their money. Story 19. True story. I was driving a taxi van on a vacation island. 2 girls, 19 years old. I'd seen around and chatted with a few times, got in and wanted to drive around, nowhere in particular. The cab seated like 12 plus people, so they just rode around with me while I drove other fares. They were all dressed up and drinking some. I'll go into detail if you want. They were like best friends, always together and always having fun together too. This was the best moment of my life. They drove around with me for a couple more hours after that, and then I dropped them back home. I did not charge them for the fare. Story 20. Out of college, I drove a cab for a summer, and one night I was driving an older couple to the airport. Turns out the wife was flying out while the husband was staying. The husband was an older gentleman in a nice suit. After he said his goodbyes, he had me drive across town where we picked up a much younger man, who I originally took to be his son. That is, until they started making out in the back seat. They had me take them to a club, gave me a nice tip, which helped alleviate the craziness I got that night. Story 21. My dad is a cab driver and so is my uncle. My dad has driven everything from dealers who have gotten pulled over and arrested in the vehicle to celebrities. My uncle once drove home 2 hot girls from the bar who began making out and having a good time with each other by the time they got to their destination. They said they had no money. My uncle said, no problem, and went home. My dad drives around many former NHL players and current CFL players and genuinely enjoys his job. Story 22. Sure thing. I've got a story. This one time, I picked up a guy from a local club, and as I am taking him to his place, there's a lady whistling from my car. My current passenger tells me to go ahead and pick her up. She's a lovely lady and tells me to go to her address. After riding for a minute or so, I start to hear some noises coming from the back. As we pull up, she pulls out her money and says bye to the gentleman in the back and makes a point to say, thanks for taking me to my husband's house, pays and leaves. The guy said nothing in the back, and I had the most shocked face on that I'm sure matched the man in the back. We said nothing all the way to his place. We both knew what one another was thinking. Today was a good day. Story 23. I've been a cab driver for 5 years, and while nothing in particular stands out as unusual, to me that is, I feel like I've pretty much seen and heard it all. I've had street workers and Johns, dealers and buyers who so often feel the need to give me some BS story about picking up their phone charger, as if I don't already know what's going on. Cheating spouses, quasi-celebrities, people lying about being celebrities, trannies, crazies, you name it. I've witnessed people getting the time of their life in the back of my cab. Picked up an intoxicated dude from the bar at 4:30 in the afternoon once. Conversation is as follows. Me. Hey, buddy, where you headed? Intoxicated dude starts crying. My marriage is falling apart. Me. Oh man, I'm really sorry. That's really terrible. Intoxicated dude. Do you know where I can get some substances? So the rest of the ride was spent with him on the phone, mostly to his soon-to-be ex's wife voicemail, deriding her for making a video, bawling like a baby the whole time. Ran into him a couple of weeks later at the gas station next to the same bar I picked him up from. He asked me if I'd take him home for $2. Buddy, $2 doesn't even start the meter. Take off. Just a day in the life. Story 24. Not really a secret, and I wasn't the driver, but when I was in San Fran, I had a crazy taxi driver. He spent the entire ride speeding and calling all the pedestrian schmucks. My boyfriend and I were terrified. He also talked about how much he wanted to go out at night and carry weapons and save people if they were getting robbed. Super nice of him, right? Except that he said if they didn't pay him for helping them, he would roughen them up. What the heck? The man was an older guy with long, gross, brown, graying hair. He has a manic laugh and will beep the horn repeatedly at people. To get him to not end you, talk about metalpocalypse. If you ever get the guy, I pretty much saved your life. Story 25. I drive in a Canadian city, and I've had an NHLer mess up his game gloriously while telling the girl he was taking home about all his expensive cars. I tried to help him out the hole he was digging for himself to get him talking about literally anything else. I then proceeded to look ahead as she gave him a whistle in the back seat. I'm glad I don't drive the same cab every night. Or there was this one guy who did some substance in the backseat, but the deepest conversation I've had with someone was whether or not he was going to divorce his wife of 5 to 7 years because she was a witch to his 15-year-old son and he was leaning strongly towards the divorce. Story 26. So this didn't happen to me, but it happened to my dad, who is a taxi driver. Some time ago, he got a call from this big rundown house in downtown LA, somewhere to pick up some woman. So he drove there and waited for her to come out, and she did, but she had a large amount of traveling bags and baggage with her. He got out, helped her out, and took her to the airport. She told him her name. I can't recall what it was, and she was African American. The bags were super heavy, and she had a ridiculous amount of jewelry on. It looked suspicious, but he just did and took her to the airport. He got a big tip, needless to say. Then a few weeks later, he got a call from the same rundown house where he picked up the woman. He took the call, hoping to get another big tip. This time, it wasn't the woman, however. It was a big, mean-looking African-American male. He didn't know that my dad was the driver who took the woman to the airport. He just told my dad to drive him around, and he was looking for a woman who had taken all his valuables and ran. He kept telling my dad that the woman owes him a lot of money, and he was going to punish her when he found her. During the drive, he kept getting calls from people, and they would tell him that they can't find the woman or that she isn't at so-and-so place. He would then tell my dad to go to a different location if that was where they were headed, meanwhile just dropping 20s from the back seat every time he made a request. After driving for nearly 4 hours looking for her, he gave up and tipped $100 when the trip was down on top of it all. My dad told him it was too much, but he just said, "Don't worry, I like it this way." A week later, he was reading the newspaper and he stumbled upon a picture of the same rundown house and a picture of the guy he transported next to it. It turned out that that was the HQ for a big ring, and the man he transported was the guy running it. The woman who had taken everything and left had told the cops about it and helped them by giving names. And if you're enjoying the video, don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos just like this. Story 27. Pretty funny one from my dad, not a secret, just a good story. He was a taxi driver in the 80s in Norfolk, England, just a student job for the summer in his hometown. The owner of the taxi company had an ongoing feud with the local chief of police, and as such, the local police would always pull over any of his cabs just to screw him over. My dad gets pulled over one day, and after the copper can find nothing wrong with his details, etc., he checks the tires on the car to find that one of them was overworn, but only minimally. The PC starts writing a ticket where he gets a call over his radio saying his wife needed him as she was going into labor. The copper tells my dad to wait where he is until another patrol car arrives to deal with the situation and drives off. My dad, the opportunist he is, quickly called another cabbie on the radio to bring him another tire to swap with his bald one. Another patrol car comes along, sees the newly changed tire, and has no option but to let my dad go. Story 28. My boss moonlights as a taxi driver in the city about 20 minutes from my hometown, and she always has crazy stories about her passengers. Well, one night, some friends and I managed to get into a bar in said city with some fake IDs and got super trashed. We called a cab at like 2 a.m., and guess who the driver was? My boss. Not only did me and another friend in the cab work in the same place, we both had to work the next day. Needless to say, our hungover selves had more crap to do than anyone else that day. She never told our parents, though, so she kept our secret. Story 29. I'm not a taxi driver, but I have a pretty creepy story from the passenger point of view. My best friend was partying out in Sydney with his admittedly pretty attractive older sister and a couple of her friends when they decided that they'd go home, seeing it was like 3 in the morning or something. So they catch this cab, and straight away the cab driver starts hitting on all the girls in the group. Creepy guys are a part of life, whatever, they kind of deal with it. But then it starts getting bad. He starts suggesting that they come home with him instead of where they're going and all this other crap. They let him know they're not interested in any way, shape, or form, but he's extremely insistent. Finally, my best friend and his sister snap and say, "Screw this, we don't want to go home with you, we're catching another cab." And that's when stuff goes down. Somehow they manage to get the guy to stop long enough for everyone in the back of the cab to pile out. But the creepy guy has somehow locked the front doors. Maybe he doesn't have control over the back half of the cab, we're still not sure. So my best friend's sister is locked in the front seat with this guy who refuses to let her out. Apparently, it all happened pretty quickly. No one who got out realized she was still stuck there. Luckily, she managed to quickly climb out into the back of the cab as soon as she realized what was happening and go out the rear doors while pushing him away as he tried to stop her. Worst part was when they rang to voice a very vocal complaint, there was nothing anyone could do to identify the guy, seeing no one thought to grab any of his details in the massive rush to get away from him. They all still feel really bad about that. Story 30. Late to the party, but what the heck. I drove a cab for a year in a smallish city. One time, a young couple claimed to know who was responsible for an unsolved crime. They went about disclosing it in a way that made me think it wasn't just bluster, lots of hesitation, her saying to him that they shouldn't be telling me, etc. They gave me enough info to identify the person, and I thought they were telling me so they didn't have to be the ones to actually turn him in. I called the cops after the fair, and a detective came to talk to me about it. Funnily enough, they didn't seem that interested in the lead. It was a bit surreal, but who knows what other details they knew about the case. I don't think the crime was ever solved. Story 31. Not a cab driver. I got into a cab with 12 cases of drinks and got dropped off at my buddy's party. Before I left the cab, the guy offered to buy a couple of drinks, and I said no because I thought I was going to drink them all. When I left, I called another cab and had about 3 drinks left. I ended up getting the same cab driver. He said I didn't have to pay him if I gave him the rest of my drinks. Story 32. I was a passenger in a cab once. I had called a cab for a girl I was hosting from Norway to take us to the hospital. I barely knew her. She was a friend of a friend who basically got stranded alone in Baltimore. While in the cabbie asked us why she had to go to the hospital. She had a bad night where she got too hammered in downtown Baltimore by herself and was mistreated. She woke up the next day in a seedy hotel room with a broken knee and without her wallet, which had $500 cash in it. Her knee was so messed up she needed knee surgery. She had torn her meniscus, which is knee cartilage. The cabbie got really emotional and told us his story of first arriving in America and getting mugged. Basically, his first job here was as a pizza delivery guy 20 years ago. One time he got a delivery call, and when he showed up with the pizza, he was roughened up pretty badly. He told us that most people here have treated him really poorly, and that he was glad to see that there are some Americans who treat foreigners like people. When we got to the hospital, he said we didn't have to pay him. I gave him the money and a nice tip anyway. Story 33. I'm a professional DD. I drive intoxicated people home in their own cars. One time I drove a couple home, but I dropped the girl off at some random spot where she had her car. Then I drove the guy home. Due to some other context I can't quite remember anymore, I'm pretty sure they were cheating on their spouses. My job is pretty cool. People call us up when they're hammered or set up rides in advance when they know they're going out. And we either ride a small scooter to their car, which folds up and fits in their trunk, or we have a coworker drive us there and pick us up from the end address. Story 34. I picked up this guy from the bars who was obviously married, and we had to make a stop in a sketchy part of town where he picked up some street workers. At first, I thought it was his girlfriend or something, but I saw money exchanging hands before she got in the cab. She then whistled him dry, and they ended up making a huge mess. I then dropped him off at his house, but he went inside and passed out without paying me. So I went to the front door to try to get my money, and his angry wife answered. It turns out it was their anniversary, and he had skipped their dinner plans to go downtown by himself. After trying to console her, one thing led to another, and I ended up having fun with her while the schmuck guy was passed out in the dining room. All in all, I got $20 for the cab ride, $50 for cleaning up the mess he made, and some of the best intimacy I've ever had. Story 35. I drove a cab for years while going to college. So many good stories, but one that comes to mind is this one. "So, you remember Erica?" one passenger says to another. "Oh yeah, how's she?" "Good or whatever, but you know how she was such a witch?" "Yeah." "Well, she called me the other night and wants to come over, so I tell her to. So I just started to get ready for her to come over. Man, she gets there and we start going at it. Then I just say, 'See you later.'" Laughter ensued with myself included. Driving cabs was awesome, sometimes. Story 36. I once told my cab driver that I had a fat sack. He assumed I meant substance and drove me to the police station. I was too hammered to notice. Shortly after we arrived, 2 police officers came to the cab and asked me to get out. I was confused and, to be perfectly honest, quite terrified. Once I was out of the cab, the officers asked me to hand it over. I asked them what exactly they wanted me to hand over, and that's when it dawned on me. I had admitted to the cab driver that I had a fat sack. The problem was that I was referring to my family jewels. At this point, I was basically sober and began to explain to the policeman that I had made a bad joke and that the driver clearly did not have a sense of humor, or at the very least could not see me pulling in the rearview mirror as I explained I got a fat sack. After a complete search of the cab and my pockets, the police officers began to laugh and asked me if I was actually referring to my jewels. I laughed and said, "Well, yeah, you can see them if you want." They declined and sent me home in the cab. The worst part about it was that the cabbie left the meter running the whole time. What a schmuck. But then again, I was being an intoxicated schmuck as well, so I guess. Story 37. Not a taxi driver, but I'm sure a taxi driver has told this story. 2 friends and I, relevant, all 3 thin women, were taking a taxi home after a night of heavy drinking. Not relevant, but we were in Spain and had had some absinthe. One girl thinks she'll be sick, so we dump out her purse so she can have something to retch in. We arrive at her house without incident, and as we are shoving things back in her purse, find an enormous pair of granny garments under the seat. We're laughing so hard as we get out and leave them in the taxi. The next day, we find out that they were actually from our friend's purse and were in fact from her grandmother for her monthly gas so as not to ruin a nice garment. I can only imagine the next people who got in the cab thought the same thing we did. Something along the lines of, "What the?" Story 38. Got into a cab a few months ago on the interstate, and after a few drinks, naturally you get chatty when you've had a few, so I struck up a convo while my friend was asleep on my shoulder. Asked him to tell me the funniest taxi story he was involved in. I think he thought I was far too hammered to register what his words were, so he told me he once watched a couple have intimacy in the back seat. When I say watched, I mean he noticed things getting heated, so he pulled into a car park and let them get their thing on. The meter ran to $122 and got a $50 tip from the guy for letting nature take its course. Thinking back now, I know taxis here in Australia have cameras in them, so I feel like he wasn't the only one watching. Story 39. My pop is a cabbie, and he told me these 2. On a warm spring night, he was hailed by a man who didn't appear very unusual. Not soon after the trip began, the man was complaining of being very cold. Almost to the destination, my pop turned around and the man had passed out with his arms to his sides, revealing a wound. Another time, a lady was in his cab and she asked if she could smoke, if she allowed. Next thing he knows, she raises her lit cigarette where she inhales and exhales through a hole with a yee sound. Sort of secrets? Deep, though. Story 40. Not a cab story, but a story about someone who thought it was a cab, kinda. My grandpa always told my dad to lock the car doors, especially because he lived in Chicago, although it's important anywhere. And one day my dad forgot. He was about 10 to 11 years old, and some crazy man opened the van door and jumped in, shouting at my grandpa to follow that guy because he needed to catch him. My grandpa played along, shouting, "Okay," and following the guy. Let him out a few blocks down. Luckily, nothing happened to my dad or grandpa, but something definitely could have. After the guy got out, my grandpa calmly turned to my dad and said, "That's why you always lock the doors as soon as you get in." My dad was terrified, of course, and always make sure our doors are locked now. Story 41. This is probably going to get buried, but I'll tell my story anyway. I drove a taxi in a small town in Canada over the past winter, and I picked this guy up at his house at around 2, 3 a.m., and he came out the car carrying a giant sledgehammer. I was a little sketched out initially, but he seemed friendly, so I tried not to think too much of it. We got talking, and he told me that his brother had passed away of a suspected termination a year or so earlier. He believed that his brother's now ex-wife had ended him, and since his passing, there'd been conflict between him and his brother's ex-wife, and she wouldn't return some of his brother's belongings that meant a lot to him. He proceeded to confess that she was away on vacation in Mexico at the time, so basically I was delivering him to her house for him to break into her house with the aforementioned sledgehammer and reclaim his brother's belongings. I probably should have called the cops on him, but he really did seem genuine, and he did tip well. I found out afterwards that his brother had recently been exhumed and the police had reopened the investigation into his passing. To put the icing on the cake, I also found out that the ex-wife's son and girlfriend were home when he smashed the door in and had to flee for their lives. All I have to say is that driving a cab in a small redneck town gives you an insight into a community that most people do not see. Story 42. Half overheard, but I'll tell it anyway. It was late, like 1, 2 a.m. I got a call to drive a single man to a club about 9 blocks, which seemed pretty casual. So the guy gets in the cab and he looks rushed and soaked with sweat. He tells me the club name and starts telling me about this guy who had slapped this girl he recently started seeing and how he's gonna roughen him up. I just agreed and drove him there because, like I said, he was mad. I drop him off and get another flag down from the same club 1 minute after. This guy gets in the car calmly. As he gets in, I notice he's talking on the phone with his friend saying his GF of 5 years had been cheating on him and he's on his way. At first, I was like, no way. Until he told me his drop-off location was the same as where the other guy's house was. I just drove away so fast as I could, hoping my taxi wasn't going to be the drive-by vehicle. By far the most intense night as a cabbie. Story 43. A bit late, but here goes. A taxi driver who just picked us up told us that the previous fare blew his mind. 3 people got in, a couple and another male, a friend. The boyfriend sat in the center seat and soon fell asleep. The so-called friend and the girl start kissing around the passed-out boyfriend. They arrive at the destination, tell the cabbie to wait, carry the boyfriend inside, and they both come out and go to the friend's house for some lovin'. Story 44. Had a cabbie tell my husband and me a pretty deep secret. My husband likes to talk to cab drivers and asks where they're from and how their night is going when he's hammered. I forget where the cab driver says he was from, but he tells us we don't want to know about his day. My husband keeps trying to make conversation with him and asks how he got to our city. He said he came there because his brother had married someone from there, and they just had a baby. He eventually tells us that his brother, who was also a cab driver, had recently been terminated by a passenger who didn't have enough money to pay for his fare. His brother had told the guy to just go, that he didn't want his money, and the guy just ended him. By the end of the ride, we were all crying in the cab in front of our house. Story 45. Some years ago, I took a taxi immediately after an English couple, I'm Portuguese. The taxi driver, aware that the couple didn't speak a word of Portuguese whatsoever, started speaking about how gorgeous she was and how he would like to be with her, etc. Of course, she hadn't the slightest idea of what he was saying. It is a normal procedure talk for a Portuguese taxi driver in Portugal, even for fluent Portuguese speakers, sadly. However, things started to get really freaky when he insisted in stopping the car in the middle of my run to show me a box of rubbers that he had on his trunk to, in his own words, be lucky after service when picking up some intoxicated girl who might like it. It was, at least, disgusting. Story 46. Picked up a guy who had wrapped a large 4 pounds amount of grass in USPS packaging, then wrapped it in plastic. This is in Hawaii. Asked me to drive him out to a rich neighborhood, somewhat isolated. Pulled up a garage with an Escalade and a Corvette parked out in front. The dude was on his phone the whole ride, 25 minutes of talking about how he wanted to promote his music. It was obvious he was a mule and didn't seem happy. Stared at me the whole time because I looked like a cop. Thought about calling the cops after. It was pretty obvious what was happening. Asked another cabbie about it. The other cabbie shook his head. Nah, this stuff happens all the time. Thought about it for a long time. The setup was so obvious. And if any of these stories got to you, here's more for you. YouTube thinks you're going to love this. I'll catch you in that video.